Welcome to Bethany. Today we are celebrating the 26th Sunday of Ordinary Time, Cycle C, and today we have three readings. Two of them are similar to what we were looking at last Sunday, but let's start with all three of them. Beginning with the first reading from the Old Testament that is coming to us from the prophet Amos. We had Amos's first reading last Sunday. If you want to go to a much fuller introduction into Amos's first reading, please go back to last Sunday. You will find more information, probably larger context of what we are dealing with here. However, it probably is worthy to add to last Sunday's explanation that obviously Amos is the first book prophet, meaning that there were prophets before Amos, but this is the first book that was written on behalf, at least, or this is called the Book of Amos, or Book of the Prophet Amos. He lived in the 8th century, and he, especially in today's first reading, is very critical not only about those who are doing things wrong, but he actually addresses those who would call themselves probably good Jews, just like there's many people that call themselves these days good Christians, or even more specifically, good Catholics. So these good Jews at that time obviously are worshiping in Bethel, in one of the two shrines of the north, Bethel and Dan. But the problem that pertains to them is that they really only care for themselves. They worship the Lord, they do everything that is right, but they don't even care for the country. And we see it how through those words, how Amos writes about them. He accuses them of eating cows from the stalls. Now, what does it mean? Well, obviously, normally, back in the antiquities, everybody was much poorer than nowadays, and the typical way of raising calves would be to let them graze the grass, if there was anything to be grazed, right? Now, he accuses these good Jews of eating calves that are not coming from that kind of feeding because they were fed in the stalls, which means that are fed with predominantly barley and other things that the poor people would eat. So in other words, why is it happening? Because the quality of the meat is much better. Call it ancient Wagyu, whatever. So they were going the distance to have a very expensive taste. And because they were able to pay for that, they were just simply practicing it. Another word that you can find these days is bougie. They were very bougie in the way they were going about themselves again. One more interesting thing about this first reading, because in the very last line, Amos describes them as having wanton revelry, which basically describes party. But in the original word, it could also mean that they were having some kind of a funeral repast, as if they were already drawing a conclusion about what is their true meaning, what is their true worth, or maybe even what is their true destiny. Now, based on this first reading from Amos, we still, despite the time difference and the completely different cultural setting, we still can ask several questions that might be pertaining to our lives in the 21st century. So here are the few questions that I'm suggesting to you to be asked. Are there any things that I do, or maybe I'm just simply obsessed with these things, that take me away from the way that gospel should be followed? And they take me away from seeing my neighbor as I'm supposed to be seeing my neighbor, as defined in the Gospels, especially in Luke's Gospel. Would you consider raising someone else's quality of life, right? Because maybe you are in the privileged situation and you have the means, maybe not great ones, but maybe you do have at least some means to helping someone else out. Who would that be? And how would you do that? And again, would you even consider that? Or you think that you deserve more? Maybe you demand more? Where are you on that spectrum? Maybe switching a little bit gears to a larger context of that reading. Are you wasting food or other resources, such as, for example, are you throwing out good clothing that can be used by someone else? We see that tons of food is being wasted commercially. We see also how many great pieces of clothing are being wasted at some universities after the semester is over because the students are dumping them. They have no use, and some of them even with price tags. But is it happening in your life? Are you wasting something that can be or could be used by someone else? Now, in Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 34, we read the following line. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And thus, it brings me to a question that might be quite contemporary. What is my opinion about strangers, people that look different than me, maybe even who worship different God or gods, who are culturally different from me, who are politically different from me? Am I trying to persuade them? Am I trying to fight them? What am I even thinking about migrants and asylum seekers? What is my relationship to those issues? And is my attitude towards those issues gospel-like? And finally, what is mine, what is yours, extent of your charitable life? Of course, we do focus on charity, especially during Lenten season, given. But outside of the Lenten season, when it's not as focused on, what is it that you do charitably? In many different ways of defining that: time, treasure, talent. What is the extension of your charitable life? Moving to the second reading, again, we are dealing with the first letter of Paul to Timothy. I was describing last time that both letters, 1st and 2nd to Timothy and to Titus, they were, interestingly enough, written not to communities such as Romans, Corinthians, and so on and so forth, but they were written to specific people, and these people were pastors, or they were in charge, or shepherds. Maybe that's a better way of saying that. And you see how it plays out in today's second reading. You can clearly see that he's writing to a specific person, and he is asking very specific questions. So the temptation might be, well, I am not a pastor, I'm not a shepherd, so that letter does not pertain to me, there's nothing to do with me. Well, of course, you're free to think this way, but maybe we could, or maybe even should, look at this second reading from a perspective that maybe there is something in it that actually does pertain to me, does refer to my life. So these are my questions that I am proposing to you to be asked, because Paul is writing in a very interesting way, and a challenging one too. He's writing, compete well for your faith. I don't think that many people are thinking about faith in terms of a competition, something that they have to win over someone or something. But we cannot just simply say that Paul was wrong. So the question might be, how do you understand compete well for the faith? Or maybe, let's be more specific, how do you compete for your faith? Is there any competition? Do you feel the struggle that happens? Do you feel that there is work to be done? Do you see the difficulty that it shows? Or maybe even the question might be much bigger. Do you even understand that it takes a struggle to develop good faith? It takes a struggle. It does not just simply come naturally. We have to work on it. So that's the first question, or set of questions. Second one, do you think that your faith is a private thing? In terms, well, I'm a believer, but it's nobody else's business. What church do I belong to? What faith do I actually practice? Or maybe your view of things is the opposite. And thus, another set of questions, such as, for example, can you proudly acknowledge your faith? Admit, that's the church I belong to. That's the Christian denomination I associate myself with, especially in the context of maybe a hostile, or maybe not as hostile, but still religion-demeaning group of people that statement or witness would be demanded of you, or would surface in some context of the conversations. So am I willing to proudly acknowledge my faith? Or am I shying away? Or maybe I'm actually even not being truthful about what my faith really is. And finally, when it comes to the second reading, have you ever shared your faith journey with someone else? Maybe other than your confessor or spiritual director. Have you ever shared your faith journey with someone else? Or maybe has anyone else shared his or her faith journey with you? And how did it make you feel? What thoughts came to your mind when you were digesting that faith journey, either in a one-on-one setting, or maybe through some other media, such as, for example, in some books, in some Christian books, you may find that the authors very often in the foreword describe their journey and how it ended up at the stage that they are now describing. So that's the second reading. And finally, moving to the gospel, obviously, you don't need my introduction to it. The gospel connects so well with the first reading. We are reading the 16th chapter of Luke, and that is important to note because the entire 16th chapter will be describing the so-called the kingdom, the economic kingdom, or kingdom economics, or economics of the kingdom of God, and Jesus is, in many instances, you may go back to last Sunday, for example, to see how Jesus is describing certain connections between a person and money and wealth, what's wrong about it, how it should be treated, and so on and so forth. So today is another installment of that, not that this is the last one that we will find in the Gospels. But before I even go into it, there's been a story in the rabbinic heritage, much older story than the Gospel, which is very similar to today's Gospel. So there's a rich man who is self-absorbed, and he is so much about himself, but that story ends differently as compared to the one that we find in Luke, because that wealthy man actually decides to do the right thing, and obviously the story ends more positively for him. Today's story is a little bit negative, if not very much negative, about this gentleman who has some interaction with Lazarus, but in a very limited capacity. But there's a couple of points I would like to make. The first one, because if you follow the gospel, right, it first brings to your attention the issue of clothing, what both of them were dressed like, especially the wealthy man, and it says that he was wearing purple clothing. Now, back in the days, that clothing was mostly made out of wool, and typically when it comes to wool, it would be either bleached, and that was a very lengthy and expensive process. So if you were wearing wool that was dazzling white, as we would read it elsewhere, that was already indication of your wealth. But if that was expensive, purple color was even more expensive. So if he was wearing a purple collar of his clothing, that was the ultimate indication that he's very wealthy. We could probably compare it to designer clothing nowadays. So what you see in, I don't know, in Vogue and many other magazines, that would be the type of clothing that the person would be wearing. So that's the first indication of the wealth. The second indication is the issue of food that is also being mentioned, kind of similarly to the first reading, and it says that he was dining sumptuously every day. That suggests that there was a big feast, kind of compared to the story that we find in the story of the prodigal son, right? That comes back, and the father is now throwing a big party. Now, that kind of a party would feed hundreds of people. Now, today's gentleman is doing this every single day. Even wealthy people could do it occasionally. So he is having an extreme wealth, a wealth that can be compared to the wealthiest people nowadays. Obviously, their wealth exceeds beyond any imagination, the wealth of those who are being described in the Bible, simply because in the Bible, or those days, poverty was everywhere, and those who were considered to be rich, they were nowhere rich to the extent of what we see nowadays, when we see billionaires, and some people say that soon we will be even seeing the first trillionaire. By the way, the question is how they read today's readings, but that's their choice, right? That's their problem. But anyway, and finally, we have the issue of dogs, because it says in today's gospel that the dogs were coming and licking the sores of Lazarus. Now, myself as a dog owner, I have a very loving relationship with not only my dog, but all dogs. That wasn't the case some 2,000 years ago. Dogs were considered to be equal to rats. So they were considered impure, and they were eating basically whatever they could get. So carcasses of whatever was lying around. So they were really not in high regards. So it adds insult to injury that we see Lazarus at the gate, which means that the man must have been really wealthy, because he has a gate even in front of his house. So he's there, he is sick, he's poor, and dogs come and lick his sores. Terrible situation. But obviously it's a story, and the story very well shows the contrast, because the contrast is the mechanism that moves the story to a very interesting conclusion. But interestingly enough, despite all of that, despite the wealth and despite all the other features, I don't know whether you noticed, the wealthy man, at least in the story, does not have a name. As if in the wealth, as if in all the privilege, as if in all the comfort that he's enjoying, he lost himself. He lost his identity, which is not that strange comparing to what we see these days, that some people who are very wealthy go through the same thing. Despite the wealth, they don't take any joy in it. Or was it Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King Jr.? I think it was Nelson Mandela who said, some people are so poor that all they have is money. That all they have is money. So Lazarus has a name, despite being at the bottom of society, and the one who is on the top, the one who would be considered to be Jeff Bezos's, Mark Zuckerberg's, and Warren Buffett's, and many others of these days, he doesn't have a name. So that brings me, of course, to a suggestion of a couple of questions for us to ask ourselves, despite the fact that our wealth might be slightly smaller, even as compared to this gentleman from the Luke's Gospel. So, are you even bothered by the presence of poor people? And I mean, not bothered that they are somewhere and maybe it's not the most appropriate place for them, but when you see poor people, do you feel something inside? Does it pain you inside? Or basically it's neutral to you? Because even if you avoid them, even if there is an avoidance, right? The avoidance is triggered by something. Because you feel something inside. So are you even moved inside by the side of poor people, marginalized people, because they don't even have to be poor in that sense, right? Do you avoid them? Why? Why do you feel threatened when you see them? Or maybe a larger context of the question. Do you believe that poor people, marginalized people, are guilty themselves for the situation that they find themselves in? Because you can hear certain arguments, right? They're being raised that that's their fault, that they are poor, that they are where they are. Do you share the same way of understanding, and why? Or maybe that brings me to a natural question that pops up right after. Have you ever spoken actually to someone who is in that predicament to get a different opinion than what comes to your own mind or what comes to your senses? But let's not just simply play it one-sidedly, right? So what do you think of rich people? Do you throw them into one basket and simply call them guilty? What are your thoughts of them? Do you despise them because they have wealth? Or maybe should you despise them because they have wealth? Is the gospel suggesting us that we should treat them worse? Of course, the story of of Matthew, right, or Zacchaeus, rather, might be very helpful. He was very wealthy. He was a tax collector, and he said that whoever he has stolen, he's going to repay it 4 times, right? So, what is your attitude towards rich people? And do you throw them all into one bag, one mixed bag? Now, we can play a little bit of a hypothetical game, and I find that game quite inspiring too. So how would you manage your money, your wealth, if you had tons of money? How would you treat the poor, the sick, the marginalized, rejected, if you were really rich? Would you even bother? What would be your charitable life? What should be your charitable life in the light of the gospel? And finally, despite the fact that you might not be as well off, is there anything that you can do today to alleviate the problem of those people who are in need? Is there anything that can be done by you? Not by the politicians, not by the system, not by the global world. You. I think these are the questions that we could, or maybe even should, be asking ourselves today, so that the Word of God that comes to us this Sunday could be effective and could be fruitful. May God bless you, and come back to our Bethany next Sunday.